Hello, my name is Janine Bryant, Director of Operations for Creed, and I'm joined by my co-founder and Executive Director, James Ford. Today, we're going to do an introduction to Creed and the Freedom Hill Coalition.
Just briefly, wanting to give you all an overview of what CREED is. CREED is a creative acronym for the Center for Racial Equity in Education. I want to tell you a little bit about the history of our organization and the work that we do. So, first of all, our mission is that we center students of color, inspire institutional change, and facilitate better educational practice to transform the education system. And you'll notice we do not say reform because we don't believe in going back. This is about moving across the traditional forms and doing something that's truly transformative in our nature. Our work is broken out into relatively three basic spheres. Um, First and foremost, we do research. We'll talk a little bit about the research that we have done up to this point, what we focus on. Our engagement strategy is super broad and super diverse and wide ranging. And lastly, is implementation. We consider ourselves not to be a think tank. We are a research to practice organization that focuses on closing the knowing doing gap to make sure that we're closing racialized opportunity gaps for students of color in North Carolina in the P20 or pre-K to post-secondary pipeline. Our research has spanned in a short year that we've been, just over a year we've been in existence, pretty broad and wide range. And we've released a historical document that has analyzed the very particular and unique history of race and education in the North Carolina context. It begins in 1865 and ends whenever it was released in 2019, kind of establishing those two factors. The second is a quantitative document that really looked at every student in North Carolina, all 1.5 million students, and really centered on race, called Erasing Inequities, and showed the ways that race predicts outcomes across different educational variables. And lastly, we have released and will continue to release education policy briefs that analyze certain policies and how they should be looked at through a racial equity lens. Our engagement is, or rather our implementation comes from the fact that Janine and I are practitioners. We come from the education space. Janine was in early education. I was in secondary education. And so we spend time in the field working with schools, working with districts on how to shift their practices to adopt more anti-racist pedagogy and be more culturally responsive or affirming in their approaches. And so we spend quite a bit of time doing actual implementation work in the field. And lastly is our biggest and most wide ranging, which is our engagement strategy. We have a podcast where we inform the public on the often untold stories of education equity within North Carolina, bringing those stories from the margin to the center. And it's called On the Margins Podcast. We have a newsletter that gets released on a monthly basis where we establish ourselves as kind of a conduit for aggregating, curating race and education news, views, and research. It's called The Rewire. We have an educator professional learning network of educators of color, Black, Latinx, mixed race, Indigenous educators, as well as allies who just want to build community and get involved in advocacy called Teaching in Color. And we have two fellowships that we oversee. One is called the North Carolina Equity Fellowship, where we take teachers, principals, school board members, journalists, and a superintendent through a year-long journey. And then we have the Charlotte Equity Fellowship, where we're literally developing local leaders who focus on the intersections of economic mobility and educational equity. And lastly, which is you're a part of, is the coalition work we're doing called the Freedom Hill Coalition, which Janine will explain a little bit more about here in a moment.
So we have an opportunity today to really talk about what is Freedom Hill. So you may have heard Freedom Hill mentioned in conjunction with Creed previously, but we do want to make sure that you know it's a coalition of like-minded education stakeholders, and that ranges from everyone to include students, parents, educators in the classroom, retired educators, people who are interested, community advocates, and grassroots organizers. We do this work because we think it's important to uplift all of our community's needs around justice and educational equity. We do this across the state in 8 different regions in North Carolina and we do it purposefully and collaboratively. So you'll hear a little bit more about our strategy, but we want to start by telling you the history of Freedom Hill.
Should begin with the fact that Freedom Hill, as we find in our initial report, Deep Rooted, is actually the first established community of formerly enslaved peoples in the United States of America. As you can see here, myself standing in front of the sign, and it just so happens to be in North Carolina. It's in Edgecombe County. It has now been incorporated as the town of Princeville, but it stands as a testament for the power, the self-determination, and the radical imagination of people who existed under the yoke of slavery, under the yoke of oppression, wanting to determine for themselves and wanting to create their own futures. And so as you see, it's not a hill. It's actually a low-lying area that is constantly, hit with adverse weather conditions and floods often. And it actually happens to be where a lot of low-income, poor Black folk live. That's kind of a metaphor for the experiences of, we think, Black people, but folks of color writ large in the education system. And so Freedom Hill is designed to change that, but inspired by that same mission. We met for the first time last year, before we even went public as an organization. And we invited some key stakeholders to kind of be the foundational members of the Freedom Hill Coalition. We met in Charlotte, presented some preliminary data from our research that looked at the way race was actually shaping the educational access and opportunities, as well as the outcomes for kids of color. And we had everyone in that room. Stakeholder groups that you heard Janine mention were all there. You had students, which you could see, you had parents, you had elected officials, you had community organizers, you had nonprofit leaders, you had everyone there. But what was exclusive about it was that it was all people of color. We understood that in order for us to embody the spirit of Freedom Hill, our vision for the future had to be inspired at the ground level, at the foundational level, by people of color. You had Black folk, you had Latinx folk, you had Indigenous folk in that room who were talking about the vision of the Freedom Hill or the summit that we want to reach from the standpoint of achieving racial equity in education.
And while this was one of the first times we met, it would not be the last time. After traveling around the state of North Carolina and hosting a number of listening sessions, we ultimately designed a statement of commitment for Freedom Hill, reflective of all of the visions we heard around educational equity and commitment to justice. And so James and I would like to read these out loud. It starts with, I stand on Freedom Hill. We are committed to
dismantling structural racism. That means to close opportunity gaps in education by demanding racial equity across all systems, housing, environmental, health, criminal justice, etc.
Focusing on large-scale change, setting goals that are practical and focused on structural and systemic changes in the education system. We aim to achieve this by organizing our communities and networks.
Honoring intersectional context, using an intersectional analysis to address issues of equity in multiple contexts from rural, suburban, and urban areas.
Embracing multiracial and ethnic solidarity. Disrupting racial binaries by focusing on issues impacting Black, Latinx, Native American, mixed race, and Southeast Asian students.
Collaborating with a broad base, and this means engaging a wide range of stakeholder groups such as parents, students, educators, activists, civic leaders, business, elected officials, and others.
And last, taking action. Action-based orientation that goes beyond just talking about problems, but works towards solutions. We have been encouraging all of our members, once they are committed to these statements and values, that they articulate that by sharing the hashtag I Stand on Freedom Hill and naming their commitments to social justice in education. So, what were we talking about at all these listening sessions, James?
Well, we found that what was interesting was many of the things we had identified in the reports mirrored, with a few additions, the concerns of folks in community. It should be no surprise that people in community didn't really need any research to tell them what they already knew and what they had already been experiencing. And so many of those things are listed here. Addressing disciplinary measures, including out of school suspensions, advanced coursework, honors and advanced placement courses for students of color. College and career readiness for students of color in North Carolina was a major issue. Access to high quality early education, not one of the things in our report, but something that bubbled to the surface. Equitable hiring practices and support of getting more teachers of color was a huge area of concern pretty much across all the regions. Supports for higher levels of engagement for parents and community members wanting to have an active voice and a stake in the process. Enrollment in gifted and talented programs, chronic absenteeism and dropout, special education and learning differences, college persistence and graduation, focusing again on that P20, and then appropriately with the wake of COVID-19, access to universal Wi-Fi broadband utilization.
You can learn more about this list by checking out our Erasing Inequities report on our website. So after listening to our community members, we made sure that we could convene together. And we did this starting at the summer of 2020, recognizing some of the limitations of gathering. We still wanted all of our community members to know what the organizing cycle is and was for CREED and Freedom Hill. And so this process is designed to create a space in which we can convene with community, listen very carefully to understand community perspectives, and use that to define the key issues and priorities for people of color in North Carolina. Ultimately, once we learn that, we can identify which issues we really want to tackle, and we can reimagine the possibilities for those issues. Then we get tactical. We dig deep into the research surrounding these issues and make sure that we communicate strategically about how we're going to take action. And of course, as a part of our central stakeholders work together, we always celebrate success and we always build in moments of joy, even as a part of our evaluation. Ultimately, everyone who participated with us had the opportunity to join a transformation team, including a narrative team that thinks about new possibilities, using research to really inform their ideas and to identify possible solutions, existing models, and reframing all the possibilities for liberation in education spaces. Second was our research team, which thinks about what is actually happening on the ground in North Carolina. This could be things as simple as knowing our class size and demographics of our state and existing regions, and even thinking about what the culture of the school and community looks like and what they need to support to be culturally affirming. This even informs what the teacher recruitment and retention pipeline looks like and who can be possible partners. The last team is our action and impact team, which looks at how we can mobilize and act towards a very specific goal, particularly if we have an issue cut that is related to the experiences of children of color. Then we need to find a way to create action and momentum around those issues and look for concrete dates and timelines to help build stakeholder engagement. If you are interested, you can text Freedom Hill to the number 22999 and get more information and even take our survey so that you can learn more about Freedom Hill and join in with more information. These commitments are not done idly. We are committed and we use this graphic to share widely in our social media networks. So feel free to look for this graphic online and use it to stay connected to our work. Thank you. Please visit www.creed-nc.org for more information. You can find out how to engage, how to implement, and what to do next for Freedom Hill.